The National Airspace System operates as a colossal, synchronized machine, managing over 40,000 daily flight vectors through a rigid architecture of sectors and protocols. At Logan International Airport, American Airlines Flight 11 initiates its departure sequence, a Boeing 767-223ER, fueled heavily for a transcontinental transit to Los Angeles. The aircraft lifts off at 7:59 Eastern, climbing through the dense traffic of the Northeast Corridor under the supervision of Boston Air Route Traffic Control Center. For the first 15 minutes, the flight adheres strictly to its filed plan, handing off between sectors with standard phraseology and expected telemetry data. At 8:13, the pilot acknowledges a routine instruction to turn 20 degrees right, marking the final verified transmission from the cockpit of Flight 11. The silence that follows is not immediately classified as a threat, as communication gaps often result from minor frequency errors or equipment malfunctions. However, the situation degrades rapidly at 8:14 when the aircraft fails to climb to its assigned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Controllers at Boston Center attempt to re-establish contact, unaware that the operational command of the aircraft has been forcibly transferred to hostile actors. The critical escalation occurs at 8:21 when the aircraft's transponder is manually deactivated, severing the electronic handshake required for secondary surveillance radar tracking. On the controller's scope, the data block displaying altitude and flight number vanishes, leaving only a raw primary return that is difficult to track. This tactical move effectively blinds the automated safety systems, forcing controllers to manually search for a non-cooperative target amidst a screen of clutter. While the cockpit remains silent, a parallel line of communication opens from the main cabin via an Airfone connection established by flight attendant Betty Ong. Ong bypasses the hijacked cockpit, patching directly into American Airlines Southeastern reservations to relay specific tactical intelligence regarding the hijacker's seat numbers and weaponry. Her report provides the first ground-level confirmation of a kinetic threat, detailing the use of mace and the stabbing of flight crew members. At 8:24, a transmission from the cockpit breaks the radio silence, but it is not intended for air traffic control or the ground sector. The hijacker, confusing the aircraft's radio function with the public address system, broadcasts a command telling passengers to remain seated and quiet. This transmission is intercepted by Boston Center, providing the first audio evidence that the event is a coordinated hijacking rather than a mechanical failure. The operational picture at Boston Center shifts from traffic management to crisis response as supervisors realize the aircraft has gone rogue in controlled airspace. Controllers observe the primary radar return of Flight 11 executing a sharp, unscheduled turn to the south, abandoning its western trajectory toward California. The turn is not erratic but deliberate, indicating that the individual at the controls possesses the navigation skills necessary to steer the heavy aircraft. Critical time is lost as the FAA's hierarchical reporting structure attempts to process information that does not fit any existing hijack protocol or simulation. Standard operating procedure dictates notifying the FAA Command Center in Herndon, which then coordinates with the Pentagon, a process too slow for a missile speed threat. Breaking the chain of command, Boston Center proactively contacts the Northeast Air Defense Sector, known as NEADS, to request immediate military assistance. The call reaches NEADS at 8:37, where military personnel are initially confused, questioning if the report is part of the scheduled Vigilant Guardian exercise. Once the real-world status is confirmed, NEADS orders the immediate scrambling of two F-15 Eagles from the 102nd Fighter Wing at Otis Air National Guard Base. The intercept order is issued into a vacuum of information, as the military radars cannot easily locate a target that has darkened its transponder. Without the transponder code, the F-15s are launching blind, reliant on verbal vectors from civilian controllers who are tracking a fading primary blip. As the fighters initiate their engine start sequence, Flight 11 accelerates rapidly, descending through the complex airspace over the Hudson River corridor toward Manhattan. The target moves at nearly 500 miles per hour, closing the distance to New York City faster than the defensive response chain can process. At 8:46, the Boeing 767 impacts the North Tower of the World Trade Center, delivering a massive kinetic energy strike to the structural core. The collision instantly severs all elevator shafts and stairwells in the impact zone, trapping hundreds of occupants above the 93rd floor. Initial reports from the ground are fragmented and contradictory, with many observers assuming the crash was a pilot error involving a small general aviation aircraft. The severity of the structural damage and the massive fuel detonation, however, suggest a heavy commercial airliner to those analyzing the physics of the impact. As the National Command Authority struggles to assess the damage, the systemic threat expands with the deviation of United Airlines Flight 175. Departing Logan shortly after Flight 11, United 175 operates normally until 8:42, when its crew reports a suspicious transmission from the first hijacked plane. By 8:47, United 175's transponder code changes twice within 1 minute, a clear indicator that unauthorized personnel are manipulating the cockpit avionics. Unlike the first aircraft, Flight 175 does not turn off its transponder immediately, allowing controllers to track its rapid climb and deviation more easily. New York Center controllers watch helplessly as the aircraft ignores all commands and initiates a steep, powered descent toward the metropolitan area. The system is now tracking two separate hijackings simultaneously, a scenario that overwhelms the limited coordination channels between the FAA and NORAD. NEADS is still focused on locating Flight 11, unaware that the aircraft has already been destroyed, while trying to process the new threat of Flight 175. The friction in communication results in a fatal delay, preventing the scrambled F-15S from receiving a timely vector to intercept the second inbound missile. At 9:03, United 175 executes a high-speed bank and slams into the South Tower, witnessed live by millions through a global media broadcast. This second impact confirms the strategic nature of the attack, dispelling any remaining theories of accidental navigation error or isolated pilot incapacitation. The United States creates an immediate de facto state of war within its own airspace, forcing a total rethinking of civil aviation defense. In Sarasota, Florida, the Secret Service initiates a protective protocol for the president, though the flow of information to the traveling staff remains fragmented. The operational tempo at the White House accelerates as the Secret Service prepares to evacuate the vice president to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Back in the skies, the contagion spreads to the Midwest as American Airlines Flight 77 goes silent over West Virginia, turning back toward Washington, D.C. Indianapolis Center loses the transponder signal of Flight 77 but fails to immediately classify it as a hijack, assuming initially it is a crash. This misclassification results in a critical gap in the military notification timeline, leaving the capital city's airspace undefended for several crucial minutes. The fog of war thickens as false reports of other hijackings begin to flood the FAA command centers, diluting resources and confusing the defensive response. This classification error creates a fatal blind spot, as controllers assume a crash rather than a deviation, delaying the alert to air defense sectors. Consequently, the military notification timeline fractures, leaving the airspace over the nation's capital completely undefended for several critical minutes. The fog of war thickens rapidly as false reports of additional hijackings flood the FAA command centers, diluting resources and confusing the response. At the FAA Command Center, National Operations Manager Ben Sliney faces a deteriorating airspace picture with no applicable historical precedent or playbook. By 9/6, the FAA imposes a total ground stop on all flights departing to or through the New York Center airspace to stem the flow. This order expands exponentially, freezing the departure of thousands of aircraft nationwide and effectively halting the vascular system of American commerce. Meanwhile, Flight 77 remains invisible to secondary surveillance radar due to its deactivated transponder slipping through the digital net of Indianapolis Center. The aircraft executes a low-altitude turn over West Virginia, re-entering the Washington, D.C. Air Defense Identification Zone as an unidentified primary target. Controllers at Dulles finally detect the fast-moving primary blip, but the identification lag precludes any effective interception by the 113th Wing. At 9:25, the FAA Command Center notifies headquarters of a potential hijack, but the specific threat vector to the Pentagon remains unarticulated. The Secret Service, operating on fragmented intelligence, rushes Vice President Cheney into the bunker-like Presidential Emergency Operations Center beneath the White House. In the skies above Washington, the air defense picture is chaotic. Langley fighters launch heading east toward the ocean due to vague vectors. Flight 77 executes a sophisticated 330-degree spiraling descent, leveling off at treetop height to strike the Pentagon's western wedge. The kinetic impact at 9:37 penetrates 3 rings of the reinforced concrete structure, devastating the Navy Command Center and collapsing the E-ring. This strike confirms that the attack profile includes high-value military and political targets, expanding the scope beyond economic symbols. Simultaneously, the fourth hijacked aircraft, United Airlines Flight 93, is already 40 minutes into its delay-plagued journey from Newark. The hijackers on Flight 93 breach the cockpit at 9:28, significantly later than the other 3 synchronized selves, disrupting the operational timeline. Because of the delay, passengers and crew access critical external intelligence via airphones regarding the fate of the Trade Center towers. They realize their aircraft is not a hostage bargaining chip but a guided missile intended for a target in the national capital region. A democratic vote is taken among the passengers to storm the cockpit, a unique instance of civilian counterinsurgency at 30,000 feet. As the revolt begins, hijacker pilot Ziad Jarrah attempts to destabilize the aircraft with violent roll and pitch maneuvers to knock passengers off balance. The flight data recorder captures the struggle for control as the aircraft inverts and dives at over 500 miles per hour. At 10:03, Flight 93 impacts a reclaimed strip mine in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, obliterating the airframe and terminating the threat vector. The intended target, likely the U.S. Capitol building, remains standing solely due to the kinetic intervention of the passengers on board. Back in Florida, President Bush's motorcade arrives at Sarasota Bradenton International, where Air Force One prepares for an immediate, unscheduled departure. The Secret Service dictates a wheels-up time of 9:55, prioritizing the physical security of the executive over public visibility or protocol. The aircraft ascends steeply, foregoing standard departure procedures to reach cruising altitude and secure encrypted communications channels quickly. A credible threat is received against Angel, the code name for Air Force One, forcing the pilot to abandon the return to Washington. Colonel Mark Tillman, the presidential pilot, initiates random evasive routing, treating the domestic airspace as a hostile combat zone. Inside the POC, Vice President Cheney issues a weapons-free engagement order, authorizing the shoot-down of unresponsive civilian aircraft. This order, transmitted through the military chain of command, places fighter pilots in the unprecedented position of targeting domestic airliners. The communication loop between the FAA and NORAD remains fractured. The shoot-down order is not clearly conveyed to the pilots in the air. Confusion peaks as controllers report a Phantom Flight 1 still airborne and heading toward D.C., triggering panic in the control centers. This goes target results from communication lag and the inability to confirm the destruction of the first aircraft amidst the chaos. At 9:45, Ben Sliney executes the command to clear the entire national airspace, ordering every airborne plane to land immediately. The Scatana plan is partially activated, grounding general aviation and military training flights to clear the sky for air defense assets. Over 4,500 aircraft begin urgent descents to the nearest suitable airports, regardless of their destination or airline affiliation. International flights inbound from Europe are diverted en masse to Canadian airspace under the contingency plan known as Operation Yellow Ribbon. Gander International Airport in Newfoundland accepts 38 wide-body aircraft, parking them nose to tail on active runways due to limited tarmac space. The sheer volume of diverted traffic overwhelms the logistical capacity of small Canadian airports, testing the resilience of the North American perimeter. By 12:16, the airspace over the continental United States is effectively empty, save for military patrols and emergency medical flights. This total shutdown represents the single largest disruption of civil aviation in history, freezing the global air transport network. Air Force One continues its erratic path, seeking a secure location with hardline communications capability to address the nation. The primary destination is determined to be Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, a strategic bomber base with robust security perimeters. While airborne, the president convenes a National Security Council meeting via a secure teleconference line that suffers from intermittent connectivity. The fog of war persists as intelligence agencies scramble to identify the perpetrators and assess the likelihood of a second wave. False reports of car bombs at the State Department and fires on the National Mall further degrade situational awareness in the POC. At Barksdale, the aircraft lands under heavy guard. The base is locked down, with Humvees and armed personnel surrounding the runway. The president is transferred to a secure conference room to record a statement, asserting the continuity of government operations. However, the location is deemed insufficient for prolonged command, and a decision is made to relocate to USS Stratcom at Offutt Air Force Base. Offutt, located in Nebraska, houses the nation's nuclear command and control infrastructure, offering a bunker capable of withstanding direct attack. The movement to the heartland reflects a Cold War continuity of government protocol designed for a nuclear exchange scenario. As the president moves deeper into the secure interior, the ruins of the World Trade Center continue to burn, altering the geopolitical landscape permanently. Air Force One touches down at Offutt Air Force Base at 14:50, taxiing immediately to a hardened hangar designed to shield high-value assets. The president disembarks into the care of the United States Strategic Command, descending into the underground command center built to survive nuclear detonation. This facility serves as the nerve center for the nuclear triad, possessing the bandwidth and encryption necessary to coordinate global military assets securely. At 15:15, a National Security Council meeting convenes via secure video teleconference, linking the bunker in Nebraska with the POC in Washington. The primary agenda items are the attribution of the attack to al-Qaeda and the operational status of the continuity of government plan. During this briefing, Director of Central Intelligence George Tenet confirms that the passenger manifests link the hijackers to known terror cells. The Angel threat, the specific claim that Air Force One was a target, is scrutinized and ultimately deemed a fabrication or communication error. This assessment alters the risk calculus, shifting the priority from executive survival to re-establishing visible leadership in the capital. Despite the strenuous objections of the Secret Service detail, the president orders an immediate return to Washington, D.C. to address the nation. The VC-25A is refueled and prepped for takeoff. Its defensive countermeasures sweep fully active to defeat potential surface-to-air threats. At 16:33, Air Force One departs Offutt, climbing rapidly into the now sanitized airspace of the American Midwest. The return flight is flown at maximum cruise speed, escorted by a rotating phalanx of F-16 fighting Falcons authorized to engage any threat. As the sun sets, the aircraft approaches the chaotic airspace of the eastern seaboard, where combat air patrols have been established over major cities. The rules of engagement for these patrols are severe. Pilots are authorized to intercept and destroy non-compliant aircraft without further consultation. Below, the wreckage at the World Trade Center site, now dubbed Ground Zero, continues to burn, illuminating the Manhattan skyline with a toxic glow. The Pentagon fire remains active, requiring the mobilization of specialized crash trucks from Reagan National and Dulles airports to contain the blaze. Air Force One begins its descent into Joint Base Andrews at 18:34, escorted by a fighter wing that flies in close formation. Wingtip to wingtip, the landing is executed under blackout conditions to minimize the visual profile of the aircraft against the darkened horizon. Upon arrival, the transfer to Marine One is immediate. The helicopter lifts off, flanked by two decoys to confuse potential ground fire. The flight path to the White House is strictly controlled, avoiding known landmarks and utilizing masking terrain to shield the approach. From the air, the president views the smoldering gash in the Pentagon, a visceral confirmation of the intelligence briefings received earlier. Marine One touches down on the South Lawn at 18:54, returning the executive authority to the seat of government after a 9-hour absence. The White House complex is a fortress. Secret Service agents armed with automatic rifles patrol the perimeter, and snipers occupy the roof. Inside, the West Wing is functioning on emergency power and adrenaline, with staff drafting the address that will define the national response. The speechwriting team works under extreme pressure to balance the need for reassurance with the preparation for imminent military retaliation. At 20:30, the president addresses the nation from the Oval Office, framing the attacks not as crimes, but as acts of war. The Bush Doctrine begins to take shape in real time, a policy that will make no distinction between terrorists and the nations that harbor them. While the speech broadcasts, the military alert level remains at DEFCON 3, the highest state of readiness since the Yom Kippur War. Carrier strike groups are already receiving deployment orders to move toward the Persian Gulf and the North Arabian Sea. The diplomatic channels are equally active. The State Department issues demarches to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, demanding immediate cooperation. Across the Atlantic, NATO invokes Article 5 for the first time in its history, declaring that an attack on one member is an attack on all. This invocation fundamentally shifts the geopolitical alliance structure, mobilizing European military assets for a conflict in Central Asia. Back in the U.S., the grounding order remains in effect. Not a single commercial flight moves in American airspace for the first night in decades. The silence of the skies is punctuated only by the roar of F-15 and F-16 fighters flying continuous sorties over Washington and New York. The FAA and the Department of Transportation begin drafting the legislation that will create the Transportation Security Administration. This marks the end of the open sky era. Aviation security moves from a private contractor model to a federalized law enforcement function. Intelligence agencies begin the massive task of data mining flight manifests, credit card records, and communication intercepts to map the al-Qaeda network. The 19 hijackers are identified within hours, their movements traced back to flight schools in Florida and safe houses in New Jersey. The operational failure of the intelligence community to connect these dots prior to the attack becomes the subject of immediate internal review. By midnight, the immediate shock has transitioned into a cold, methodical mobilization of the American industrial and military complex. The logistics of war are set in motion. Stockpiles are assessed, reserve units are identified for activation, and targets are selected. The 9/11 attacks have successfully breached the continental defense, but they have also triggered a massive asymmetrical immune response. Ground Zero becomes a crime scene, a burial ground, and a hazardous materials site, requiring a recovery operation that will span months. The structural engineering community begins analyzing the collapse mechanism, data that will eventually reshape building codes globally. For the air traffic controllers who watch the blips disappear, the shift ends in trauma counseling and debriefings with federal investigators. The tapes of the transmissions, Betty Ong's calm voice, the hijacker's commands, the confusion at NEADS are secured as evidence. These recordings capture the precise moment when the Cold War air defense posture failed to intercept a low-tech, asymmetric threat. The concept of air sovereignty is redefined. Domestic airspace is no longer a sanctuary but a potential battle space requiring constant surveillance. As the sun rises on September 12th, the smoke over New York is visible from low Earth orbit, a scar on the atmosphere marking the new epoch. The world has not just changed. The operating system of global security has been forcibly rebooted, with new protocols written in blood. The resumption of civil aviation on September 13th occurs in a phased, highly restricted manner, prioritizing stranded aircraft over new passengers. Every bag is hand-searched, and law enforcement officers are posted at every screening checkpoint, creating a visual deterrent to potential copycats. The operational fluidity of the pre-9/11 era evaporates, replaced by a friction-heavy security apparatus that treats every passenger as a potential threat. Financially, the shutdown costs the airline industry hundreds of millions of dollars per day, triggering immediate calls for a federal bailout. Congress responds with the Air Transportation Safety and System Stabilization Act, injecting billions to prevent the immediate insolvency of major carriers. This legislation is followed swiftly by the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, signed into law on the 19th of November 2001. This act creates the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, federalizing the screening workforce and removing private security contractors from checkpoints. The mandate is absolute. 100% of checked baggage must be screened for explosives, a logistical challenge requiring massive infrastructure upgrades. Simultaneously, the physical architecture of the aircraft is hardened against internal threats through the mandatory installation of reinforced cockpit doors. These new barriers are bulletproof, designed to withstand significant kinetic force and remain locked for the duration of the flight. Access protocols are rewritten. The flight deck becomes a hermetically sealed environment, isolating the pilots from the cabin crew and passengers. The common strategy for hijackings, which previously advised cooperation to protect lives, is formally rescinded and replaced with aggressive resistance. Pilots are authorized to maneuver violently to disorient attackers, and the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program begins arming volunteer pilots. This militarization of the cockpit acknowledges that a hijacked airliner is no longer a negotiating tool but a guided weapon of mass destruction. On the ground, the Department of Homeland Security is established, integrating 22 disparate agencies into a single, massive domestic intelligence umbrella. This centralization aims to eliminate the stovepiping of intelligence that allowed the 9/11 plotters to operate undetected within the United States. The technological response includes the implementation of the Computer-Assisted Passenger Prescreening System, or CAPS-2, to risk-score travelers. Watch lists explode in size. The no-fly list grows from a handful of names to thousands, creating a digital perimeter around the airspace. Internationally, the United States demands that foreign carriers provide advanced passenger information prior to departure, extending the border outwards. NORAD permanently alters its defensive posture, maintaining fighter jets on strip alert at bases across the country, not just on the coastal periphery. The mission shifts from looking outward for Soviet bombers to looking inward for non-responsive general aviation and commercial tracks. The establishment of the National Capital Region's Flight Restricted Zone, or FRZ, permanently closes the airspace over Washington to most traffic. Visual flight rules are severely curtailed near major urban centers, forcing pilots to file flight plans and maintain continuous communication. The psychological impact on the traveling public is profound. The airport experience transforms from a transit hub to a security processing center. Removal of shoes, limitations on liquids, and body scanners become the ritualistic price of admission to the National Airspace System. Operation Noble Eagle continues indefinitely, with combat air patrols becoming a sporadic but visible reminder of the ongoing threat state. The cultural memory of the attacks is encoded into the operational manuals of every airline and air traffic control facility in the Western world. Every Squawk 7500 code triggering a hijack alert is now treated as a lethal threat requiring immediate military interception. The lag time between a reported anomaly and a fighter scramble is reduced from minutes to seconds through streamlined command and control. Interagency communication exercises are mandated regularly to ensure that the friction observed on 9/11 does not recur during a future crisis. The concept of domain awareness becomes the new doctrine. requiring the total fusion of radar, flight plan, and intelligence data. Privacy concerns regarding passenger data are largely overruled by the imperative of national security and the fear of a secondary attack. The overarching strategy shifts to preemption, stopping the threat before it reaches the tarmac rather than managing it in the air. Intelligence gathering becomes the primary line of defense, with the airport checkpoints serving only as the final physical failsafe. The legacy of September 11th is a permanent structural alteration of global mobility, defined by surveillance, hardening, and mistrust. The innocence of the open skies is replaced by a managed risk environment where every passenger is a data point to be analyzed. While the fires at Ground Zero are eventually extinguished, the regulatory and military structures erected in the aftermath remain active. The Department of Homeland Security becomes a permanent fixture of the federal government, growing in budget and authority every year. The wars launched in response to the attacks consumed trillions of dollars and spanned 2 decades, reshaping the Middle East and Central Asia. Yet, the most enduring change is found in the quiet, sterile corridors of American airports, now the most secure public spaces in the nation. The system works because it has been engineered to assume the worst, treating the anomaly not as an error, but as an attack. Air travel is safer, statistically, than ever before. But that safety is purchased through the surrender of anonymity and convenience. The narrative of 9/11 is not just about the day itself, but about the permanent reconfiguration of the boundary between liberty and security. The skyline of New York eventually rises again, culminating in One World Trade Center, a fortress of reinforced concrete and blast-resistant glass. It stands as a physical testament to the new doctrine: resilience through hardening, survival through superior engineering, and vigilance. The memory of Flight 11, Flight 175, Flight 77, and Flight 93 is preserved not just in memorials, but in the procedures of the FAA. This is the final legacy of the attacks: a world where the sky is open, but the ground is always watching.